The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Abigail Dawson crouched lower behind the overturned wagon, clutching her bleeding leg and fighting back tears. What had begun as a simple journey to her sister's homestead had turned into a nightmare when outlaws ambushed her wagon train. Now, as the sun dipped low on the horizon in the autumn of 1875, she was alone, injured, and terrified as the distant sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Abigail had been widowed just 6 months prior, when influenza took her husband of 3 years. At 26, she had decided to leave Pennsylvania behind and join her sister's family in Montana territory. The journey west had been arduous but uneventful until this morning, when the small wagon train she traveled with was attacked just a day's ride from her destination. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Abigail pressed herself against the wagon, praying whoever approached wasn't returning to finish what they started. Her dress was torn and soaked with blood below the knee where a bullet had grazed her. She tried to stand but collapsed with a sharp cry. "Hello? Anyone alive out here?" A deep voice called. Abigail froze, weighing her options. The voice didn't sound like the gruff tones of the outlaws who had attacked earlier, but she couldn't be sure. "Please," she called weakly, deciding that death by gunshot might be preferable to slowly bleeding out alone on the plains. "Over here." A horse snorted, and moments later a tall figure appeared around the edge of the wagon. The fading sunlight outlined his broad shoulders and the Stetson perched atop his head. "Madam, you hurt." The man approached cautiously, his rifle held ready but not aimed at her. "They shot me," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "Everyone else is gone." The stranger holstered his gun and knelt beside her. In the dimming light, she could make out a weathered face with kind eyes, perhaps in his early 30s. His clothes were dusty but not ragged, and his movements deliberate as he examined the area around them before focusing on her. "Name's Matthew Norwood," he said, his voice softer now. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles from here. Heard the shots earlier but couldn't get here in time." His eyes flicked to her leg. "May I?" Abigail nodded, wincing as he carefully pushed back her torn skirt to examine the wound. "It's a graze, but deep. You've lost blood." He looked up at the darkening sky. "Night's coming, and so might those bandits if they realize they left someone alive. We need to move." Abigail tried again to stand, but her leg buckled beneath her. "I cannot walk," she whispered, frustration and fear evident in her voice. Without hesitation, Matthew scooped her into his arms. "Then I'll carry you," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The journey to Matthew's cabin was a blur of pain and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek as he rode with her cradled before him on his horse. He spoke little, occasionally murmuring reassurances when the path grew rough and jostled her injured leg. The cabin appeared just as true darkness fell, a solid structure nestled against a stand of pines with smoke curling from its chimney. "You left your fire going?" Abigail asked, surprised. "My friend Winter Elk is staying with me, Apache scout who works with the army sometimes. He'll have heard us coming." As if on cue, the cabin door opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the ground. A Native American man stood silhouetted in the doorway, rifle ready. "It's me," Matthew called. "Got company, ladies hurt." Winter Elk nodded once and disappeared inside as Matthew dismounted, still holding Abigail. He carried her into the cabin as if she weighed nothing, placing her gently on a narrow bed against the wall. The cabin was simple but tidy, one main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and 2 beds. A door led to what Abigail presumed was a storage area. The scent of coffee and stew hung in the air. "Winter Elk, this is." Matthew paused, looking down at Abigail with a question in his eyes. Abigail Dawson," she supplied, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Winter Elk nodded in greeting. "I will fetch water and medicine," he said, his English clear but accented. He disappeared through the side door. "He knows more about healing than most doctors," Matthew explained, gathering clean cloths from a trunk. Served as a scout for the army until last year. Now he helps me with the horses sometimes. You have a ranch?" Abigail asked, trying to distract herself from the pain. "Small one, nothing fancy. I break horses for the army and local ranchers." Matthew's hands were surprisingly gentle as he eased off her ruined boot. "What were you doing out there alone, Mrs. Dawson?" "Not alone," she corrected. "We were 6 wagons, families mostly. I was traveling to join my sister near Fort Benton." She swallowed hard. "I don't know if anyone else survived. It happened so fast." Winter Elk returned with a basin of water and a leather pouch. He knelt beside the bed and examined her wound with clinical detachment. "Clean shot. No bullet inside," he announced. "Will hurt to clean, but will heal." Abigail nodded, steeling herself. "Do what you must." The next hour was agony as Winter Elk cleaned and treated her wound, applying a poultice of herbs that smelled sharply of pine and something bitter. Matthew held her hand throughout, his calloused palm warm against her fingers as she fought not to cry out. By the time Winter Elk finished bandaging her leg, Abigail was exhausted, her face pale and damp with sweat. "She needs rest now," Winter Elk said, gathering his supplies. "And food when she wakes." Matthew nodded. "I'll send word to Fort Benton tomorrow about the attack." "What's your sister's name, Mrs. Dawson?" Anna Fletcher. Her husband Thomas has land north of the fort." Abigail's voice was fading as exhaustion claimed her. "Please, call me Abigail." The last thing she remembered was Matthew draping a quilt over her and the comforting crackle of the fire. Abigail woke to sunlight streaming through small windows and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she was disoriented, panic rising as she tried to sit up. "Easy now," Matthew's voice came from nearby. "You're safe." The events of the previous day flooded back and Abigail relaxed slightly, looking around the cabin. Winter Elk was gone, but Matthew sat at the table, a mug of coffee before him. "What time is it?" she asked, her throat dry. "Just past 9. You slept near 14 hours. He stood and brought her a cup of water. Winter Elk left at dawn to scout the area and check for other survivors. Abigail drank gratefully. "Thank you for everything," Matthew shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps, but it was you who found me," she shifted, wincing. "I need to get word to my sister. She'll be worried when I don't arrive. I've sent a message with a passing trader heading to Fort Benton. Should reach her in a day or 2. He hesitated. "Winter Elk says you shouldn't travel for at least a week. That leg needs time." Abigail sighed, recognizing the truth in his words. "I don't wish to impose." "You're not imposing," he said firmly. "Besides, my mother would haunt me if I turned out an injured widow." Over the next few days, Abigail began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The news Winter Elk brought back was grim: no survivors from the attack, and the outlaws long gone with whatever valuables they could carry. Her trunk with her few possessions had been among the items stolen. "I have nothing," she whispered when Matthew told her. "Not even a change of clothes." That evening, Matthew returned from the nearest trading post with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said, handing it to her, "just some necessities." The shopkeeper's wife helped me guess the sizes. Inside, Abigail found 2 simple dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small bar of lavender soap. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "I'll pay you back when I reach my sister's," she promised. Matthew waved away her words. "Consider it a welcome to Montana gift." As the days passed, Abigail found herself drawn to the quiet cowboy. He was unlike any man she had known before, steady, self-sufficient, with a dry wit that emerged once he grew comfortable in her presence. He spoke little of his past, though she gleaned that he had come west after the war between the states and had been in Montana for almost a decade. A week after her arrival, Abigail was able to stand and take a few careful steps, though her leg still pained her. "You're healing well," Matthew observed as she made her way from the bed to the table for dinner. "Winter Elk's remedies work better than anything from a doctor's bag." "I'm grateful," she said, settling into the chair, "though I fear I've been a terrible burden." No burden, he replied simply, serving her a plate of rabbit stew. It's been. He hesitated, seemingly searching for words. Nice, having someone to talk to in the evenings. The simple admission touched her. She realized that despite Winter Elk's occasional presence, Matthew's life was largely solitary. The next morning, Winter Elk arrived with news. Rider coming, from Fort Benton. Abigail's heart leaped. My sister? No, Winter Elk shook his head. Man, military. An hour later, a soldier arrived carrying a letter. Mrs. Dawson? He asked when Matthew led him inside. Yes, Abigail said, rising carefully from her chair. Letter from Fort Benton, madam. He handed her an envelope and tipped his hat. Captain asks if you need escort to your family when you're well enough to travel. Abigail thanked him and opened the letter with trembling fingers as the soldier accepted Matthew's offer of coffee. The contents made her knees weak, and she sank back into her chair. What is it? Matthew asked, alarmed by her sudden pallor. My sister and her husband, Abigail whispered. They're gone. Typhoid fever swept through their settlement last month. Their neighbor wrote this when he heard I might be coming. She looked up, eyes filled with shock. I have nowhere to go. After the soldier departed, promising to return with news of any recovery efforts from the wagon train attack, Matthew sat beside Abigail at the table. What will you do now? He asked gently. Abigail stared at the letter in her hands. I don't know. I have a little money sewn into my petticoat. The outlaws didn't find that. Perhaps enough for passage back east, though there's nothing for me there either. She looked up, her expression lost. I have no family left. Matthew was silent for a long moment. You could stay, he said finally, his voice cautious. Montana Territory needs good people. Fort Benton's growing, might be work for a woman with education. How do you know I'm educated? She asked, surprised. A slight smile crossed his face. I've seen you eyeing my books. Not many out here care for Shakespeare or Emerson. Abigail felt a blush warm her cheeks. She had indeed noticed his small but carefully chosen collection of books, an unexpected treasure in a frontier cabin. I was a teacher before I married, she admitted. Though I'm not certain those skills are in demand here. You'd be surprised, Matthew replied. There's talk of building a proper schoolhouse in town. Until then, you could stay here. The offer hung in the air between them. Abigail studied his face, trying to read his intentions. There was nothing improper in his expression, only genuine concern and something else, a hesitant hope, perhaps. That would hardly be appropriate, she said softly. A single woman living with a bachelor. Winter Elk stays here half the time, Matthew countered. And there's the storage room could be made into proper quarters for you, just until you're settled. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly awkward. I just meant, you have options, is all. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. In the short time she'd known him, Matthew Norwood had shown her more kindness than many had in a lifetime. Thank you, she said. I'll consider it. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed, Abigail faced her reality. She was alone in the world with limited resources and few prospects. The sensible choice would be to use her small savings to secure passage to a larger city where she might find employment as a teacher or companion. Yet something held her back from making that decision. In just over a week, this simple cabin had begun to feel like a sanctuary. Matthew moved through his days with quiet purpose, never making her feel like an intrusion. When Winter Elk visited, the two men included her in their conversations, valuing her opinions in a way her late husband rarely had. Thomas Dawson had been a good man in many ways, but their marriage had been one of convenience rather than passion. He had wanted a proper, educated wife to manage his household. She had wanted security after her parents' deaths left her with few options. They had developed a comfortable affection, but never the deep connection she had always secretly hoped for. The next morning, Abigail watched Matthew as he worked outside the cabin, repairing a section of fence. His movements were efficient, his focus complete. There was something compelling about his self-sufficiency, the quiet confidence with which he approached each task. When he came inside for the midday meal, she had made her decision. "I'd like to stay," she said as he washed his hands in the basin. "At least until I'm fully healed and can make proper plans." Something like relief crossed his features. "Good. That's good." That afternoon, Matthew and Winter Elk, who had arrived with a deer over his saddle, began converting the storage room into a proper bedroom for Abigail. They moved crates and tools, hung a curtain across the doorway for privacy, and brought in a narrow bed frame that Matthew had apparently been crafting in his spare time. "You were making this for me?" Abigail asked, surprised. Matthew shrugged, looking embarrassed. "Seemed wrong, you sleeping in my bed while I took the floor. Figured you might be here a while." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. As October turned to November, Abigail's leg healed, though a scar remained where the bullet had torn her flesh. She took over the cooking and mending, grateful to contribute something in return for Matthew's generosity. Winter Elk came and went, sometimes staying for days, other times disappearing for a week or more on hunting trips or work for the army. One evening, as the first snow of the season fell outside, Matthew returned from town with supplies and news. "Talked to the mayor about you," he said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "He's interested in having a school. Says if you're willing to teach, they can offer room and board with the Reverend's family in town, plus a small salary." Abigail looked up from her mending, her heart suddenly heavy. Of course this was coming, she couldn't stay in Matthew's cabin indefinitely. This was the opportunity she needed, the chance to rebuild her life. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "When would they want me to start?" "Not until spring," Matthew replied, poking at the fire. "Roads get bad in winter, wouldn't be safe for children to travel daily." He glanced at her. "So you'd still be here a while, if you want." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by confusion at her own reaction. Why should the prospect of leaving this cabin and Matthew fill her with such dismay? The answer came to her in the middle of the night as she lay listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere in these weeks of quiet companionship, she had developed feelings for the taciturn cowboy. It wasn't just gratitude for his rescue and generosity. It was something deeper. A connection that had grown through shared meals and conversations by the fire. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had not expected to feel this way again, certainly not so soon after losing Thomas. And Matthew had given no indication that he saw her as anything more than someone in need of assistance. The following weeks brought heavy snow that blanketed the landscape and isolated the cabin. Winter Elk departed for his people's winter camp, leaving Matthew and Abigail alone. They settled into a comfortable routine, Matthew tending the livestock in the small barn and hunting when weather permitted. Abigail managing the cabin and preserving food for the lean months ahead. In the evenings, they read aloud from Matthew's books, their voices the only sound beyond the crackling fire and the howling wind. Abigail discovered that Matthew had a fine mind beneath his quiet exterior, with thoughtful opinions on everything from politics to poetry. As Christmas approached, Abigail realized she had no gift for the man who had given her so much. After much consideration, she secretly used scraps of fabric to piece together a quilt, working on it when Matthew was outside. The design was simple squares of blue and brown that reminded her of the Montana sky and earth, but she poured her heart into every stitch. On Christmas Eve, they shared a special dinner of venison and dried apple pie, using the best of their stores to celebrate the holiday. As they sat by the fire afterward, Abigail retrieved the carefully wrapped quilt from her room. "I have something for you," she said shyly, holding out the package. Matthew looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't need to do that." "I wanted to," she replied. "Please open it." His large hands were surprisingly delicate as he unwrapped the parcel. When he shook out the quilt, his eyes widened. "Abigail, this is." He trailed off, running a hand over the careful stitching. "No one's made something like this for me since my mother died. Do you like it?" She asked anxiously. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you." He stood suddenly. I have something for you too." From under his bed, he withdrew a wooden box and handed it to her. Inside, nestled on a bed of cloth, was a silver hair comb inlaid with small pieces of turquoise. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, watching her face. "She came west with one of the first wagon trains, said it always reminded her that beauty can be found even in the harshest places." Abigail touched the comb reverently. "Matthew, I cannot accept this. It's a family heirloom." "I want you to have it," he insisted. "It suits you." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something shifted in the air. Matthew moved closer hesitantly, as if afraid she might pull away. When she didn't, he gently took the comb from her hands and placed it in her hair, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You've brought life back to this cabin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To me." Abigail's heart pounded as she looked up at him. "You saved my life," she replied, "in more ways than one." Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, Matthew lowered his face to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and when Abigail responded by sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When I found you by that wagon, I just wanted to help. And now," Abigail asked, her voice trembling slightly, "now I want you to stay, not just until spring. Not just until your leg is fully healed." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Dawson." The words sent joy spiraling through her. "I believe I'm falling in love with you too, Matthew Norwood." Winter passed in a sweet haze of deepening affection. They maintained separate sleeping quarters, both aware of propriety despite their isolation, but spent every waking moment together. Matthew taught Abigail to shoot a rifle, insisting she needed to protect herself in the frontier. She taught him to make proper biscuits, laughing at his flour-covered attempts. By February, when Winter Elk returned with news from Fort Benton, they had made their decision. "We're getting married," Matthew told his friend as they sat around the fire. "In the spring, when we can get to town." Winter Elk nodded, his expression unchanging save for a slight twinkle in his dark eyes. "Good, you smile more now." The Apache's simple observation made Matthew laugh, and Abigail realized it was true. The reserved, solemn man who had rescued her months ago now laughed freely and often. As the snow began to melt in late March, revealing the first hints of green beneath, Matthew and Abigail rode into Fort Benton. The small town was just waking from its winter slumber, buildings being repaired and gardens being prepared for planting. The Reverend married them in the newly constructed church, with Winter Elk and the mayor's wife as witnesses. Abigail wore one of her simple dresses with Matthew's grandmother's comb in her hair. Matthew wore his best shirt and a new pair of trousers he'd ordered specially from the general store. After the ceremony, the mayor approached them with a proposition. "Mrs. Norwood," he said, still testing out Abigail's new name, "our offer of the teaching position still stands. We've set aside money for a proper schoolhouse to be built this summer." Abigail glanced at Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. "I would be honored," she replied. "Though I'll need to ride in from our ranch." "Of course," the mayor agreed. "Many of our children do the same." School would be Monday through Thursday, giving everyone Friday to prepare for the Sabbath and tend to chores. On the ride back to the cabin, their home now, truly Matthew reached across to take Abigail's hand. "Happy?" he asked, his expression open and vulnerable in a way he showed to no one else. "Very," she assured him, squeezing his fingers. "Though I admit I'm nervous about teaching again after so long." "You'll be wonderful," he said confidently. "Those children are lucky to have you." That night, as husband and wife, they shared the larger bed, the quilt Abigail had made draped across them. As moonlight filtered through the window, Matthew traced the scar on her leg gently. "I still remember finding you," he murmured. "How brave you were, despite everything." Abigail stroked his face, memorizing its contours with her fingertips. "I remember you carrying me into this cabin. How safe I felt in your arms." "I'll always carry you," he promised. "Whenever you need me to." Spring blossomed into summer, and with it came changes to their lives. The schoolhouse was built in Fort Benton, a simple but sturdy structure with real glass windows and desks fashioned by the local carpenter. Abigail began teaching 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, riding into town on Monday mornings and returning home each afternoon on a gentle mare Matthew had trained especially for her. Their cabin expanded as well, with Matthew and Winter Elk adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area. Matthew's horse-breaking business flourished, his reputation for firm but humane training spreading throughout the territory. In late summer, as they celebrated their first harvest from the small garden Abigail had planted, she shared news of her own. "I believe we'll need to add another room by next spring," she said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Matthew looked at her quizzically, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Abigail, are you saying?" She nodded, her hands going to her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby." The joy that transformed his face was something she would remember all her days. Matthew knelt before her chair, resting his head against her lap as she stroked his hair. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "A wife, a child, a true home. After the war, I thought I was too damaged for such things." "We heal each other," Abigail said softly, "every day." Winter came again, harsher than the previous year, but the expanded cabin was warm and secure. Abigail's classes were suspended until spring, giving her time to prepare for the baby and finish the small quilts and gowns she was making. On a clear, cold February morning, with Winter Elk fetching the midwife from town through deep snow, Abigail gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret, after Matthew's mother, with the middle name Hope for what they had found in each other. "She's perfect," Matthew whispered, cradling the tiny bundle in his arms with a mixture of awe and terror. "So small. She'll grow," Abigail assured him, exhausted but radiant, "and she'll be strong like her father." "And wise like her mother," he added, carefully returning the baby to Abigail's arms. As spring returned to the Montana Territory, bringing with it the 5th anniversary of Abigail's arrival at the cabin, their lives had settled into a rhythm of work and love and family. The school in Fort Benton had grown, now boasting 20 students and an assistant for Abigail. Matthew's horse ranch had expanded to include breeding stock, with plans for a larger operation in the coming years. One evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching 4-year-old Margaret chasing fireflies with Winter Elk's patient guidance, Matthew took Abigail's hand. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "When I found you by the wagon." Abigail nodded, her eyes on their daughter's laughing form. "Often. How different our lives would be if you hadn't heard those shots, if you hadn't come looking." "I wasn't even supposed to be in that area," Matthew admitted. "Was heading in the opposite direction but felt drawn to investigate. Like something was pulling me there." He squeezed her hand. "To you." "Perhaps it was fate," Abigail suggested, "or providence." Matthew smiled, the expression no longer rare on his face. "Whatever it was, I'm grateful. When you whispered, 'I cannot walk,' and I carried you into this cabin, I had no idea I was carrying my whole future in my arms." Abigail leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days after losing everything. "And I had no idea that being wounded and stranded would lead me to the greatest happiness I've ever known." As the sun set over the Montana plains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Matthew drew his wife and daughter close, marveling at how a moment of tragedy had transformed into a lifetime of joy. The cabin that had once been a solitary man's refuge now stood as the heart of a home filled with love, laughter, and hope for all the years to come.